Welcome to the Amaravati Today Daily World News Roundup, where we bring you the latest, most important developments from across the globe. Colombo. Sri Lankan President Anura Kumara Dissanayake retained the key finance minister portfolio and reappointed Harini Amarasuriya as Prime Minister on Monday as the Indian Ocean island nation targets stronger recovery from a draining financial crisis. Dissanayake, whose leftist coalition won a record 159 seats in the 225-member parliament in a general election last week, also reappointed veteran legislator Vijay Herat to helm the Foreign Affairs Ministry. Kyiv, 2 children were among 11 people killed when a Russian missile hit a residential building in Ukraine's northeastern city of Sumy, Ukrainian officials said, while another missile strike left the region's administrative center without power. 89 people, including 11 children, were also injured in the attack on the city late on Sunday, Ukraine's state emergency service said via the Telegram messaging app. Manila. The Philippines and the United States signed on Monday a military intelligence sharing deal in a further deepening of defense ties between the two nations facing common security challenges in the region. Visiting U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin signed the agreement with his Philippine counterpart, Gilberto Teodoro, at Manila's military headquarters, where both officials also broke ground for a combined coordination center that will facilitate collaboration between their armed forces. Sydney. Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will meet China's President Xi Jinping in Brazil on Monday, as Beijing seeks to promote Australia as a model for trading with China in a Trump era, even as Canberra draws closer defense ties with Washington. The meeting with Xi, which Australian officials said would take place on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro, comes a year after Albanese traveled to Beijing to end a years-long diplomatic dispute that saw billions of dollars worth of Australian exports to its largest trading partner blocked. Moscow Russian lawmaker Maria Butina said on Monday that the administration of President Joe Biden was risking World War III if it had allowed Ukraine to use U.S.-made weapons to strike deep into Russia. These guys, Biden's administration, is trying to escalate the situation to the maximum while they still have power and are still in office, Butina told Reuters. New Delhi. A thick blanket of toxic smog engulfed most parts of northern India on Monday, and readings of air quality in the capital New Delhi hit their highest this year after dense fog overnight. The smog, a toxic blend of smoke and fog, happens each year in winter as cold air traps dust, emissions, and smoke from illegal farm fires in some surrounding states. Rio de Janeiro. Leaders of the group of 20 major economies were set to meet on Monday in Brazil for their annual summit, bracing for a shift in the global order with the return to power of U.S. President-elect Donald Trump. Discussions of trade, climate change, and international security will run up against sharp U.S. policy changes that Trump vows upon taking office in January, from tariffs to the promise of a negotiated solution to the war in Ukraine. Manila. Super Typhoon Man-yi swept across the Philippines' main island of Luzon on Sunday, threatening heavy rain in the capital region Metro Manila, after triggering more than 1 million evacuations and damaging buildings in several areas. Packing winds of 185 kilometers per hour, 115 miles per hour, it weakened slightly after hitting land in the town of Panganiban in Catanduanes province on Saturday night, to arrive over the coastal waters of Camarines Norte province by 8 a.m., weather officials said. Rio de Janeiro. Diplomatic tensions over global warming spilled over into the G20 summit negotiations in Brazil this week, with sources saying the 20 major economies reached a fragile consensus on climate finance that had eluded UN talks in Azerbaijan. Heads of state arrived in Rio de Janeiro on Sunday for the G20 summit and will spend Monday and Tuesday addressing issues from poverty and hunger to the reform of global institutions. the talks must now also grapple with how to address escalating violence in Ukraine after a deadly Russian airstrike on Sunday. Tegucigalpa's slow-moving tropical depression Sara headed on to Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula after unleashing widespread floods over Honduras and Belize that killed at least one person and forced thousands to flee, officials said on Sunday. The U.S. National Hurricane Center, NHC, forecasts that Sara will weaken as it moves further inland over Mexico's Quintana Roo state, but warned that rainfall over the area could trigger floods and mudslides. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer will meet Chinese President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro on Monday, his office said in a statement on Sunday. Starmer will call for Britain and other major economies to engage with China pragmatically on areas of mutual cooperation, including international stability, climate and growth, Downing Street added. Hong Kong. Dozens of Hong Kong pro-democracy activists will be sentenced later this week in a years-long subversion trial that has spotlighted what critics say are erosions to the city's freedoms under a China-imposed national security law. The case has drawn international scrutiny since the mass arrests of over 50 Democrats in early 2021 for organizing an unofficial and peaceful primary election in 2020 to select their strongest candidates for a local election. Sydney, Australia's Senate on Monday censured an Indigenous woman parliamentarian over her protest against King Charles during his visit to the Parliament last month when she accused the British monarch of genocide. Independent Senator and Indigenous activist Lydia Thorpe shouted that she did not accept Charles' sovereignty over Australia moments after he delivered a speech in which he paid his respects to the traditional owners of the lands. Hong Kong. A Hong Kong court will this week sentence 45 Democratic campaigners in a major national security trial, with potentially heavy jail terms poised to further damage the financial hub's once lively pro-democracy movement, critics say. In May, 14 of the 47 Democrats were found guilty of the charge of conspiracy to commit subversion, and 2 were acquitted. Earlier, 31 had pleaded guilty, hoping for reduced sentences. Washington President Joe Biden's administration has allowed Ukraine to use U.S.-made weapons to strike deep into Russia, 2 U.S. officials and a source familiar with the decision said on Sunday, in a significant reversal of Washington's policy in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Ukraine plans to conduct its first long-range attacks in the coming days, the sources said, without revealing details due to operational security concerns. London. Britain will seek backing from other United Nations Security Council members on Monday for its demand that Sudan's warring parties stop hostilities and allow deliveries of aid, the British Foreign Ministry said. With London holding the rotating presidency of the Council, British Foreign Minister David Lammy is due to chair a vote on a UK/Sierra Leone proposed draft resolution, which also calls for the protection of civilians. Beijing. Chinese President Xi Jinping arrived in Rio de Janeiro on Sunday to attend the G20 summit and is set to have in-depth talks with Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Chinese state media reported on Monday. In a statement, Xi said he looks forward to having an exchange of views with the Brazilian president on further enhancing relations between the two countries, Xinhua News reported. Manaus, Brazil. Joe Biden became the first sitting U.S. president to visit the Amazon rainforest on Sunday, flagging the dangers of global warming often dismissed by President-elect Donald Trump, who has vowed to scrap measures to fight climate change. Biden flew from Lima, Peru, to Manaus, Brazil, the largest city in the Amazon, to meet with local leaders working to preserve the rainforest. He was to head afterward to Rio de Janeiro for a summit of the group of 20 major economies that will address issues including poverty, global governance, and climate change. Paris. Farmers will protest across France on Monday as the prospect of a trade deal between European and Mercosur countries sharpens discontent over foreign competition that fueled a farming crisis earlier this year. A push by the European Union and South America's Mercosur bloc to conclude long-running trade negotiations by the end of the year has rekindled anger in France. Dakar expectations were growing that President Bassirou Diomaye Faye's party would win Senegal's Sunday legislative elections after two opposition leaders conceded while votes were still being counted. The heated campaign period had revived concerns about unrest as political rivals clashed, sometimes violently. The West African nation saw some of the worst political violence in recent history ahead of the presidential election in March. Seoul, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un urged the country's military to improve capabilities for fighting a war in a speech last week, state media KCNA said on Monday, after Pyongyang dispatched thousands of troops to Russia. Kim delivered the speech to a conference of battalion commanders and political instructors held in Pyongyang on Friday, during which he called for building political and military strength and fighting efficiency to ensure that the armed forces can cope with a war. Beirut. Lebanese armed group Hezbollah confirmed its media relations chief Mohammed Afif was killed by an Israeli strike on a building in central Beirut on Sunday. Israel has rarely hit senior Hezbollah personnel who do not have clear military roles, and its airstrikes have mostly targeted Beirut's southern suburbs, where the group has its heaviest presence. Moscow. Washington's decision to let Kyiv strike deep into Russia with long-range U.S. missiles escalates the conflict in Ukraine and could lead to World War III, senior Russian lawmakers said on Sunday. Two U.S. officials and a source familiar with the decision revealed the significant reversal of Washington's policy in the Ukraine-Russia conflict earlier on Sunday. Lima. Peru's president signed defense and mining cooperation deals with her Japanese counterpart on Sunday, following an official visit between the two leaders just after the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit hosted by Lima. The agreements were signed by Peru's President Dina Boluarte and Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, who in remarks touted what he described as a 10-year cooperation roadmap. Baku. The world's warming tropical wetlands are releasing more methane than ever before, research shows, an alarming sign that the world's climate goals are slipping further out of reach. A massive surge in wetlands methane, unaccounted for by national emissions plans and undercounted in scientific models, could raise the pressure on governments to make deeper cuts from their fossil fuel and agriculture industries, according to researchers. Rio de Janeiro. A Russian airstrike on Ukraine on Sunday shook a fragile consensus among the group of 20 major economies drafting their joint statement at an annual leaders' summit in Rio de Janeiro, three diplomats familiar with the talks told Reuters. European diplomats are now pushing to revisit previously agreed language on the topic of global conflicts after Russia unleashed its largest airstrike on Ukraine in almost 3 months. The United States responded by lifting prior limits on Ukraine's use of U.S.-made weapons to strike deep into Russia. Cairo. Dozens of Palestinians were killed or injured in an Israeli strike on a multi-story residential building housing at least 6 families in northern Gaza's Beit Lahia town on Sunday, medics and residents said. The Palestinian Civil Emergency said around 70 people were living in the property, but the Gaza government media office put the number of those killed at 72. Kyiv. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Sunday the missiles would speak for themselves after reports that Washington had granted Kyiv permission to conduct strikes deeper into Russia with U.S.-made missiles. 2 U.S. officials and a source familiar with the decision revealed the significant reversal of Washington's policy in the Ukraine-Russia conflict earlier on Sunday. Buenos Aires. French President Emmanuel Macron said that a major Russian air barrage against Ukraine on Sunday showed that Russian President Vladimir Putin does not want peace and is not ready to negotiate. The priority for France was to equip, support, and help Ukraine to resist, Macron told reporters as he prepared to leave Argentina to attend the G20 summit in Brazil. London. The UK government is believed to be in talks with Turkey, Vietnam, and officials in the Kurdistan region of Iraq about possible payments to help slow the flow of migrants heading for Britain, the Times newspaper reported on Sunday. Prime Minister Keir Starmer told reporters it was the right thing for Britain to dissuade people from leaving their home countries and making the journey, which often involves perilous crossings of the Channel, the Times said. Lima Chinese President Xi Jinping vowed on Saturday to work with the incoming U.S. administration of Donald Trump as he held his final talks with outgoing President Joe Biden on conflicts from cybercrime to trade, Taiwan, the South China Sea, and Russia. Biden met Xi for about 2 hours at a hotel where the Chinese leader was staying, on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum in Lima, Peru, for their first talks in 7 months. Berlin. The new leader of Germany's Greens pitched his party on Sunday as the only one that could save Germany from years of stagnation under a renewed grand coalition, and offered the conservative frontrunners cooperation on reforming a totemic spending cap. Robert Habeck, economy minister in Social Democrat Chancellor Olaf Scholz's government, which collapsed 10 days ago, was anointed the party's candidate for the February 23 election by 96% of delegates at the National Congress in Wiesbaden. New Delhi. India said on Sunday that it would tighten restrictions, including on construction activities and vehicle movements in New Delhi and surrounding areas from Monday to combat worsening air quality. The new measures, effective from Monday morning, entail a ban on diesel trucks in Delhi, the closure of educational institutions, and a shift to remote working, as advised by the local administration. Kyiv. All Ukrainian regions will experience temporary restrictions on power on Monday following Russia's massive airstrike on the energy system, the national grid operator said. Russia unleashed its largest air attack on Ukraine in almost 3 months on Sunday, killing 7 people and further hobbling an already damaged energy system. Tela, Honduras. Wading through waist-deep water, residents along the northern coast of Honduras trudged through the streets on Friday, carrying their belongings and pets, as heavy rains from Tropical Storm Sara caused widespread flooding across the area. Sara churned menacingly near the Caribbean coast of Honduras, close to beach resorts and ancient Maya ruins popular with tourists, as the storm also took aim at neighboring Belize and Guatemala. Rome. Pope Francis has suggested the global community should study whether Israel's military campaign in Gaza constitutes a genocide of the Palestinian people, in some of his most explicit criticism yet of Israel's conduct in its year-long war. In excerpts published on Sunday from a forthcoming book, the pontiff said some international experts say that what is happening in Gaza has the characteristics of a genocide. Kyiv. Russia unleashed its largest airstrike on Ukraine in almost 3 months on Sunday, launching 120 missiles and 90 drones that killed at least 7 people and caused severe damage to the power system, officials said. Ukrainians had been bracing for weeks for a renewed Russian attack on an already hobbled energy system, fearing long winter blackouts and mounting psychological pressure almost 1,000 days after Russia launched its full-scale invasion. Jerusalem. The Israeli military issued call-up notices to more members of the ultra-Orthodox community on Sunday to bolster its forces as it fights on its southern and northern borders, a move that may further inflame tensions between religious and secular Israelis. The Supreme Court ruled in June that the Defense Ministry could no longer grant blanket exemptions to Jewish seminary students from the conscript military, an arrangement in place since around the time of Israel's establishment in 1948, when the number of ultra-Orthodox or Haredi was tiny. Dhaka. About 1,500 people died in protests that brought down Bangladeshi Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina this year, and as many as 3,500 may have been forcibly abducted during her 15-year rule, interim leader Muhammad Yunus said on Sunday. The estimate by the economist and Nobel Peace Laureate, who is due to organize elections, is higher than the previous official count of about 1,000 deaths in the student-led demonstrations, which drew a ferocious crackdown. Wuxi, China. A former student went on a stabbing rampage at a vocational college in eastern China, killing 8 people and injuring 17, police said on Sunday, prompting further soul-searching just days after the deadliest attack in the country in a decade. Saturday's knife attack took place at the Wuxi Vocational College of Arts and Technology in Yixing, part of Wuxi City in the eastern province of Jiangsu. The suspect, a 21-year-old man, was arrested at the scene and confessed, police said. Islamabad. Pakistan discussed its $7 billion bailout reform agenda with the International Monetary Fund during an unscheduled staff visit last week, Finance Minister Mohammad Aurangzeb said on Sunday, suggesting no new taxes are to be imposed. The talks in Islamabad came within 6 weeks of the IMF approving the bailout, an unusual move as it is rare for the fund to discuss reforms ahead of a review of the reform plan under the loan program. Berlin German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said his conversation with Vladimir Putin on Friday had given no indication of a shift in the Russian president's thinking on the war in Ukraine, but defended his much-criticized decision to phone the Kremlin. Scholz's hour-long call with Putin, their first direct communication in almost 2 years, comes 3 months before snap elections in which the wildly unpopular chancellor faces a stiff challenge from populists of left and right who are demanding a resumption of diplomacy. Guwahati, India. Police arrested 23 people on Sunday in the northeastern Indian state of Manipur for ransacking and setting fire to the homes of lawmakers and ministers, while hundreds demonstrated against recent violent killings in defiance of a curfew. The violence, marking the second straight day of unrest in the area, has led to a tense standoff in Imphal, the state capital. Abuja. Nigeria and India on Sunday agreed to deepen collaboration in maritime security, intelligence, and counterterrorism during a state visit to the West African country by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Modi is the first Indian premier to visit Nigeria in 17 years after an invitation by President Bola Tinubu, who is seeking investments from some of the world's biggest economies. Lviv, Ukraine. When Russia poured troops into Ukraine nearly 3 years ago, Yaroslav Simkiv expected a global backlash that would force it to quickly end its full-scale invasion. Since then, the graying trumpeter has provided the aching soundtrack to hundreds of military funeral processions as they have streamed through the cobblestone streets of Lviv. Rio de Janeiro. Brazil's First Lady, Yanya Lula da Silva, swore at billionaire Elon Musk during a G20 social event on Saturday, at which she spoke about the need to regulate social media to rein in misinformation. A ship's horn sounded as she spoke, and she joked, "I think it's Elon Musk," before adding, "I'm not afraid of you, fuck you, Elon Musk." Sydney. Japanese troops will begin regular deployments in northern Australia as part of military cooperation with Australia and the U.S., Australia's Defence Minister Richard Marles said on Sunday. Around 2,000 U.S. Marines are already hosted in Darwin, the capital of the Northern Territory, for 6 months of the year amid growing concern among Washington and its allies about China's growing military power in the Indo-Pacific region. Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan said in a statement on Monday that he had asked a number of high-ranking officials to step down from their positions. The reasons for making such a request are not personal, but systematic, which I have spoken about publicly, Pashinyan wrote on Facebook. Russia's TASS state news agency reported separately on Monday that Interior Minister Vahey Gazarian had resigned. It cited his spokesperson.